Thank you for inviting me. Um, and thank you all for being here. As almost anybody would know, anybody who's had anything to do with filmmaking, it's actually almost impossible to talk about editing. Um because editing is something that sort of goes right into the body of the film. It's almost invisible, actually. And I'm not talking about seamless editing here. I'm not saying that commonly what we call seamless editing, where the editing is not visible. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the editing where editing is affecting even the structure of the film very, very strongly. But even so, because editing is so embedded inside the body of the film in terms of its structure, that it is very often very hard, and I wish Bina was here, but I know that Bina agrees with me that it's almost impossible to speak about editing, which is also because a lot of the times editing is done very intuitively. And so that's another reason where it becomes difficult to talk about it. Nevertheless, when I was asked to do this, I thought that maybe one should try. In fact, because we don't talk about editing, it may be interesting to see what one can do. So I have tried to actually, I would say, sort of excavate, and I use that term deliberately because it's almost like going inside something and trying to remove everything else and then to see what was happening in the editing. Um, so we will get into it. Before I start, I'd like to just read out very briefly. Uh, I had done a very small, like a two-line write-up for this session, which I see is not there in the publication. So I'll just sort of read it to you anyway. Moments and narratives in reality. How do narratives emerge in documentary? What are the constituents of the drama of the real? What is the relationship between the mundane and the metaphorical? And how can perception of the filmed reality enable insight into resonance? What can become a defining documentary moment? And when does less become more in the creation of meaning through editing? An interactive session on some of these questions. I do hope we'll be able to make this an interactive session. I think that if you all have any questions or comments, it would be really lovely to have them. Because the idea is really to, not to make this into a lecture, but more into a way that it can enter all our sort of thought processes and engage with all the thought processes. So please do feel free to, bring up anything. And if you feel the moment is not right, then just make a note of it and, we can address it soon. So, since we have limited time and there are potentially several things really that one could talk about in this session. So, what I'm going to do is just go right into it. And what I'll do is start with some references to student work. So it will be students from, the course that I had, students from other places. We'll address those and then we will see some of my own editorial work, other people's work, and so on. So, there is a way in which when we talk about editing, I think that we often think of it as craft or skill, which is fine, which is what it is. Also, there's a way in which it's a bit like, if somebody is learning music, then you learn how to hear the note first, and then you learn how to render the note, perhaps. And if you're playing an instrument, then you have to learn how to hold the instrument. And all the technical things that go with it. And it's the same in any creative field. I mean, it would be the same in painting, for instance, that you have to know how the color behaves, how to mix it, what the brush does, how to hold the brush, what do you do when the brush is spoiled, when you know when the brush is spoiled, etc. And editing in that sense is so similar because, of course, you have to know the tools, whatever the tools be of your choice. With changing technology, all that keeps changing. In addition to that, you also, of course, have to know your let's say tricks of the trade. I mean, there's a way in which every editor would have to know, make us feel and call something like editing, unlike something like cinematography. Editing very often is called a craft, you know, a craft or a skill. So I feel that it could be interesting for us to see if this something went wrong with that. I think you can go back to the earlier equalization. I think we can see how uh, this may require some restatement and some reinvention, perhaps. So to look at editing as craft is fine, but perhaps we need to redefine craft a little. Because finally, are we saying that it's possible for editing to be based on a series of templates? Could we say there's a series of editing tricks, editing styles, editing methods that could be used depending on the kind of film you're making? So could we say in a generic way that if I'm working with a director, let's say if it's not my own film and I'm working with a director who's doing a poetic kind of film, could I work with certain templates as an editor? If somebody's doing an investigative film, could I work with those templates? And so on and so on. You know what I'm getting at. As soon as we enter this, we realize that this is not so, actually. There are actually no templates that will do for any genuinely creative piece of work that's trying to communicate anything with any sincerity. But I think this is all a little abstract. So let me now actually get into some examples that we can look at and then talk through those. So I'm going to start with, I'm going to refer to some student work, like I said, first. And I'm going to start with showing you a series of still images. These are still images which are extracted from static shots. So in the film also, the shots are static, but they're not still images, they're moving shots with a soundtrack. But I'm going to start with that just to see that if we see a series of still images, what other kinds of stories, oblique narratives, oblique thoughts, oblique emotions, what are the impressions that we get from looking at this? So I will just start this. And I'm sorry, you'll have to keep yourself from not looking at that screen when there's nothing on it. I'm not able to switch it off because the remote doesn't have that AV mute. Can we dim the lights, or how does it work? Because every time I show something, can everyone see at the back? Is it okay? think lots of people can't see. It's too bright, I think. Can you just, increase of the screen? Yes, sure. Let's do that. Is it okay? Is it better at the back?
Yeah.
Shall we carry on? Okay. So just for the people who come in late, and I can see there are others who come in late, it's just briefly to say that all that we've done so far is to try and look and see if editing is skill, craft, can it be template based, can we edit in different ways in different kinds of films, quite apart from learning the tools, so to speak, of the trade. What is that engages us in editing? And we are starting to look with some student work. We're looking at some stills, just to start with, to see like a basic storytelling. What is the kind of narrative, if at all, that's emerging? Okay, so maybe we can keep the lights like this because very soon I'm going to show something else. So would there be any responses to this? Anything at all? Windows, nice. Okay, thank you. Thank you for stating the obvious. We need to do that. Yes, Windows. And when you just look at it, yeah, okay, sure, it's Windows. In fact, I'd be happy to stay with that for now because there may be some. Would you like to say something?
Middle class economy?
Middle class economy, yeah. So, like that, I'm sure there are a lot of thoughts in our head right now. It's Windows, it's middle class, it's all kinds of thoughts. It's maybe thoughts about what's going on inside those windows. It's maybe thoughts about just the pictorial quality. A couple of the shots are very, kind of have a quiet sort of beauty. Conflict, okay, interesting. Second floor, yeah, absolutely. So this is basic narrative happening. This is basic storytelling happening. Now what I'll do for you is I'll play about a 2-minute segment which has no picture. There's only sound. And it is with subtitles because it's a certain kind of very rustic Hindi. So I've kept the subtitles but removed the picture. This is all from the same student film. It's really a pity I can't mute this because you see all the mess.
पता
नहीं, हम आए थे तो ये रही ना कबर 3 तो यहाँ पे भी रही है, सब में कबर थी, 1 2 2 तो इस घर में भी कह रहे कि इस हिस्से में कबर थी, हमारे से पहले आने से पहले बता रहे थे इसलिए। तभी तो रोज रोज परेशान होते रहते हैं, कभी कुछ हो रहा है कभी कुछ हो रहा है। मेरा थोड़ा सा नु है कि मैं अपनी जो देवता उन्हें भी मानती हूँ और साथ में इसे भी मनाती हूँ, इसके इस पे भी जाती रहती हूँ, कभी इधर चली जाती हूँ, कभी अध्यापी के पास चली जाती हूँ, कभी दरगाह में चली जाती हूँ। भाई अपने बच्चों की नहीं हो तो सभी कुछ धर्म का क्या करना मान के नहीं। और ये भूत प्रेत तो ऐसे हो कि भाई इनको अपने कब्जे में कर भी लेते हैं लोग, छोड़ भी देते हैं कुछ दिन के बाद, इनसे काम करवाते, बता नहीं रहते आपको दिन आप साहब। तो ये हवा तो ऐसी ही होती है ना।
आजा आजा इसी वाले घूमने का, आजा आजा। अरे चल, सारा दिन इसका घर उसका घर उसका घर करते रहती है, कुछ और तो देख लिया कर, दिन दुनिया बाहर निकलते
ना इसमें ना ना इसमें तो 3 4 पेड़ है, और ससुर का पेड़ है इसमें है ना, ससुर का पेड़।
पपीता का पेड़ नहीं है
यहाँ तो नहीं। मैं तो सोच रही थी कि मैंने यहाँ पे खड़ा देख पाता हूँ। मुझको भी नहीं ऐसा लगता था जैसे मेरे को पीछे परछाई आ रही है, मेरे को ऐसा लगता था जब मैं बता रहे थे तेरे को, तब उन्होंने किया था तो कुछ थोड़ा बहुत वो हो गया था, अब नहीं होता मेरे को। मैं दुकान पे भी चली जाती हूँ, बड़ी में भी चली जाती हूँ, मुझे डर नहीं लगता इतना कर।
Okay, this is longer, but we can stop here. Now, I think let's not labor the point. Let's just get into. You have, I'm sure, all of you collected some feelings around this sound narrative as well, in terms of the kind of. It's thrown up a lot of things to think about. Now, let's see a segment which actually brings these together. It's going to be a segment from the film. For some reason, I'm not being able to control the sound from here. So whoever is looking after the sound, just increase or decrease according to. Yeah? This is about 2.5 minutes.
पता नहीं, हम आए थे तो ये रही ना कबर 3 तो यहाँ पे भी रही है, सब में कबर थी, 1 2 2 तो इस घर में भी कह रहे कि इस हिस्से में कबर थी, हमारे से पहले आने से पहले बता रहे थे इसलिए। तभी तो रोज रोज परेशान होते रहते हैं, कभी कुछ हो रहा है कभी कुछ हो रहा है। मेरा थोड़ा सा नु है कि मैं अपनी जो देवता उन्हें भी मानती हूँ और साथ में इसे भी मनाती हूँ, इसके इस पे भी जाती रहती हूँ, कभी इधर चली जाती हूँ, कभी अध्यापी के पास चली जाती हूँ, कभी दरगाह में चली जाती हूँ। भाई अपने बच्चों की नहीं हो तो सभी कुछ धर्म का क्या करना मान के नहीं। और ये भूत प्रेत तो ऐसे हो कि भाई इनको अपने कब्जे में कर भी लेते हैं लोग, छोड़ भी देते हैं कुछ दिन के बाद, इनसे काम करवाते, बता नहीं रहते आपको दिन आप साहब। तो ये हवा तो ऐसी ही होती है ना।
वालेकुम मेरा आ जाओ आ जाओ और चल सारा दिन इसका घर करते रहती है कुछ और भी तो देख लिया कर तेरी दुनिया बाहर निकल के
हाँ इसमें ना इसमें तो 3 साल के लिए बस सूट का प्रिंट चलेगा इसमें है ना सूट का प्रिंट
बबीता का पेड़ नहीं है।
हाँ तो नहीं मैं तो सोच रही थी कि मैंने यहाँ पर खड़ा देखा था मुझको भी नहीं ऐसा लगता था जैसे मेरे को पीछे परछाई आ रही है मेरे को ऐसा लगता था जब मैं बताने लगे थे को तब उन्होंने किया था तो कुछ थोड़ा बहुत वो हो गया था अब नहीं होता मेरे को मैं दुकान पर चली जाती हूँ बड़ी में चली जाती हूँ मुझे डर नहीं लगता इतना करे
Okay, so we see some sort of narrative that happened here. Would anyone like to share anything about this narrative that you saw just now? In terms of how it came together? Okay, maybe as we go on. So, this exercise is really to kind of look at the idea of how meaning gets created. And when we talk of sound and image, then the narratives in the sound and the narratives in the image and the way they come together, is this, where is this impulse coming from? Let's try and see that, Is this something that an editor just does, just decides to put these images and these sounds together? Or is this something coming from a space that is invisible? I would suggest that that invisible space is the core of the film. The main impetus behind the film, the main reason for that film to exist, the main, if we like, the soul of the film, in a way, is what will ask an editor, if the editor is steeped in the work, to actually try and find a conjunction like this. And how did this material get created? Let's look at that. So, in this case, I can tell you, and this will be a very common experience in non-fiction filmmaking, that the material is collected in a completely different way and turns into a completely different thing, though they are united by the common concerns in the film. So, just to give you a little background, first let me read out some words from the synopsis of the film. I think you'll see that they'll relate to the excerpt that you just saw. So the filmmaker finds in some spaces and people a canvas of internal and external spaces. Yeah, so windows, really. She didn't know that the windows are going to become windows to the soul of the film and the soul of the main protagonist of the film. But so she says a canvas of internal and external spaces. The filmmaker explores various elements of the physical and psychological that prevail in our society, elements that shape our fundamental ways of being. What are the expressions of desire, longing, pain, grief, belief, strength, and joy? The complexities that possess this known and unknown world. I think that even that little excerpt you all saw would have given a little sense of this. Now, when we look at how the material was generated, so the windows, were they shot thinking they would be used like this? Not at all. For this, I'll have to give you a little background. The windows were actually shot over 2 afternoons. When the filmmaker was roaming the streets of Mehrauli, for those of you who know Delhi, it's one of the older parts of Delhi, in the south of Delhi. She was in the process of making a film, and as we know, that can often be quite troubling, and so she was rather troubled. And there was a protagonist in the film. There was this housewife, Nirmala, who was the protagonist, and the filmmaker Nundrisha had set out wanting to make a film around her life, but not at all wanting to make it a stereotypical character-based film, which means that she didn't want, that revelation of the character's personal life. She didn't want that interview in which finally that character cries and that becomes a defining moment of the film. She didn't want all those things, but she wanted somehow to communicate a sense of the kind of life and its nuances and its predicaments. So that's a tough job she had taken on anyway. But what added to the problems was that the woman that she was interacting with was actually doing the exact opposite of what Nundrisha wanted her to do, which means that she was completely telling her all her secrets. She was telling her all her secrets. She was telling her things she had never told anyone ever before. She was saying, "You're the only real friend I have," etc., etc. So the filmmaker was completely stuck in this kind of weird ethical dilemma, not knowing what to do. And it was during this time that she was roaming around and she also shot these windows. The conversation you hear, that was shot, that was recorded at a completely different time, another day, another whatever, a week later or something. You hear a reference there to papaya leaves also, and I don't know, I think you all are luckily not so familiar with it here, but in the north, we have this season starting now where the dengue fever is raging absolutely. And one of the preventives, I think, and cures maybe is papaya leaves. This woman, the protagonist of the film, was just walking with a young friend from the neighborhood, and they were, as you hear, they're talking about many things. It's a completely rambling conversation. Our young filmmaker Nundrisha had set out to film this along with a friend who was recording on the Zoom recorder. And what happened was basically that at some point she stopped filming the walk because for her it wasn't really working out for X number of reasons. But the Zoom recorder got left on by mistake. And later, while going through the material, the footage, the sound and so on, in the process of editing, she heard this. The filmmaker heard this. And for her, it was an electrifying moment because she felt that this is a possibility. Here is a possibility of depicting this life, in a way that is not intrusive, in a way that does not reveal secrets, and it became, like a center. So I'm not saying that this sequence is the film, not at all, but the sequence is some kind of core around which the film started to build, So, so I think it's really interesting how these things actually happen during the process of editing. So it's really the pauses, the rhythm, all of that creates a new configuration of meaning. So there was a way that a new meaning was found for the rushes by staying close to the search for a particular way of wanting to understand the realities that were being represented. So I don't know if this is too abstract, but the point that I'm trying to make is that for the editor and the filmmaker to sort of stay close to finding that intention is what may create a possibility of editing in a certain way. This is not about templates. This is not about craft alone. This is very much about understanding narrative and creation of meaning. That somebody could say this and say, "Oh, how nice the editing is." The editing is not just nice, it's actually concerned with the meaning that's being created in the film. And please tell me if this is too abstract, because then I can just totally change it to something else. So, sure, yeah. So the thing is really about how to deploy technique at the service of meaning that you wish to create, you know. So I feel editing is a lot about taking notice, being on full alert and allowing resonances to expand. So since we have seen that being able to view your material in the first place, to see what are the possibilities it contains, seems to be, in a way, if we begin at the beginning in a sense, this seems to be the crux of it. That's the first stage. And there are n number of instances where I have gone through myself as an editor, and friends of mine and other people we've gone through it, where we've said, we realized way down the line, like a month down the line or years down the line, sometimes we realized that we were so jaded, our eyes were so habituated and conditioned that we could not see. We could not see what the material was trying to tell us, you know. And so it's like these gems that you just throw away because you can't see them. And so I think to begin at the beginning, really, to understand editing, you have to understand looking. You have to understand how to see rushes. And it's in that, I'll give you a few examples, but it's so interesting to see how an NG, you know, a not good shot can become an okay shot, and a okay shot can be complete rubbish. You know, it just turns on its head. Who will teach this through templates? I don't know. How do you learn editing through templates? You have to learn it in this way. So I will get into another project, another short project. Okay, so I'll just give you a very brief background. Again, maybe reading a synopsis will help. So another student, this is from another batch, was fascinated by, and mind you, these are the diploma films I'm talking about. So, you know, after doing a year or year and a half's course, they're doing their final individual project, where each student directs and edits their own film. So it's a big deal, you know, in a sense. I mean, you put yourself into it. So this other student was Gagan. He was fascinated by the sight of a man sitting on the pavement, who would sit on the pavement every day selling cigarettes, but his face was painted white. So, you know, it's one of those things. Gagan had been passing by and seeing this man every day, and he said that for years this curiosity had been building up. Yeah, we could have. This curiosity had been building up. That who's this man? Why is his face painted white? What's his backstory? What could be his family life like? All those things that happen. I'm sure we have parallel experiences, all of us, seeing something that is strange, you know. And the synopsis of the film: a man sits by a busy road, his face painted white. Passers-by gaze at him, he is difficult to ignore. The film explores these different experiences and interactions, the vulnerabilities that perhaps we all carry in a public space. This is the thing. So without further ado, let me first show you an excerpt. We have to have the lights on. her. So you see, this could be called a character-driven film, as many documentaries are. So we look for a certain kind of action, a certain kind of moment, some detail, some revelation, etc. in a film like this. So it's actually a very common assumption, as we know, in non-fiction, in documentary, that we need characters. These characters will reveal things about themselves. Those revelations, usually embedded in interviews, often will contain emotion and other events, other slices of life. This will form the substance of the story, the material of the story that we will edit. But perhaps it would be possible to look at all this in some other way too. And I'm taking inspiration here from what happened with Gagan. So it's not just about the film possibly being composed of characters that we need to cultivate a relationship with, so that we can film them, sort of to strategize, how do I get close to this person, etc., all that stuff. But perhaps we could look at it as a terrain that instead of saying, let me see version of the equation of power. And the reason I talk about all this is, of course, because it directly affects the editing, not just the shot taking, but the editing. So in a way, this process inverts the equation and brings the onus on ourselves as filmmakers. And so when Gagan had started work on this film, trying to see what is the backstory, what secrets it will reveal, but as he went on, it completely shifted and changed into something else. And this was through a process of research and observation, lot of spending time on the site, that he quite intuitively felt somehow a little undignified in trying to strategize and make this strange white-faced man and draw out his inner secrets. So Gagan instead decided to just sit, just sit, occasionally buy a cigarette, occasionally smoke a cigarette, but just be around that space. And in the process, something different started to happen. Because Gagan started to see his preoccupations much less as trying to get the backstory of this strange man, and it turned much more into a story about really patriarchy. Looking at patriarchy, looking at hierarchies of different kinds, looking at how vulnerable this man was, and what a strange, brave position he had taken by painting his face and sitting there. And he wasn't fitting in with the normal social structures, and he was quite a threat as a result. To the extent that in Gagan's research, when he was moving around, there were localities nearby, residential localities, offices, there were guards. And when the guards, after seeing Gagan around so many days, the guards even said, "Hey, what are you doing here? Why are you?" So he said, "Well, I'm interested." And so he said, the guards told him, he said, "Be careful of this man, he's not okay." And there was actually nothing that he was doing wrong, that could be considered suspect in any way, except that he was primarily a threat to the predominant patriarchal social structure, just because he was, as a man, behaving so weird. He had his face painted white. So Gagan's preoccupations then became much how it affected his work. So what we'll do is now we'll look at some of his rushes, unedited rushes. I'll show you from there. See how actually these rushes, some of them look like nothing or look like NG, and why they became significant for the film. How many of you here are filmmakers? Could you please raise your hands? Okay. Now, I don't know if I should risk this or not, but I am very tempted to show you a long shot, which is very unnerving to watch because nothing happens. Now, the point is, the reason that I'm saying this is because I must say that the whole process, and since observation of rushes is the first step in this, actually, let me not talk, let me show it to you. That's it. I can't adjust from here. This is not working. Why is it not working?
HDMI cable also.
Should I try? No, I can try playing it. Why can't it just work? It's not blocked. It's very dumb. Reduce it.
Can you use the
Let's just see peacefully.
now the sound is off.
It doesn't matter. It's fine.
goes, no one is noticing him. He's missing, he's watching everyone, he's seeing every car, every vehicle. But no one cares about him. This is his life.
Yeah, so she says this is the sense of his life, which is also very true.
What about those hand gestures?
Yes,
Those
those
are-
hand gestures that
are
come
intriguing.
after this interminable 3 minutes actually. The hand gestures, what do you think they are?
I'm intrigued.
Yeah, I mean he's gesturing to somebody he knows.
Yes.
So there's a sense of home, a sense of familiarity in this space, with just the gesture. That he's been in this space for a long, long time. Till he makes that gesture, you can't tell that. As soon as he does that, you realize, oh, okay, knows. He's anything else?
That shot was used in the real film, isn't it?
In the edit, it has been used. Now, this is exactly my point, that actually, I do think, sorry, somebody said something?
No, I said that I saw this.
Yeah, I thought somebody else, no. If we didn't have the stamina to watch a nothing shot like this for 3 minutes, I don't think we can be editors or even filmmakers. It's a strange thing. You have to have a combination of patience, extreme alertness, and responsiveness, and being able to breathe all together. You know, it sounds almost like some Zen-like state. But I'm editors, where precious material like this has been junked, gone to trash, because you never could have the stamina to look for the moment. So actually, yes, there are many moments in this, and there are other moments which I will show you briefly, shorter ones, not to worry, from rushes that normally look like they're all wrong, they're NG, they don't have any action, they don't have anything worthwhile. But that actually became very useful for the film. So I'll just show you a few of these together without. kids watch this also to see NG and not OK shots.
पहले वैसे बहुत तरह की बातें करते थे मेकअप के बारे में मेरे को कहते थे पहले लड़की वाली क्रीम लगा दे तुमको
I'll show you another section. We can talk about both.
यहाँ पे जैसे कोई बीवी और बीवी साथ जाते हैं बाइक में उसका आदमी चला रहा बाइक ड्राइवर करके तो मैं भी इसको करता था एक दिन तो आधी रात में था उसने मेरे को बाय बाय करा तो मैं भी करा बाय बाय अब उस आदमी ने बहुत वापस भी आया बोल के वापस नहीं आया यहाँ पर कह रहा आपने मेरी बाइक बाय बाय किया मैंने कहा किया मैंने क्या हो गया मैंने क्यों किया मैंने पहले मुझे मुझे बाय बाय पहले किसने किया एक चीज को बनाने में काफी टाइम लगता है जैसे मैंने जवानी इसको बनाने में लोग 5 साल लगे बनाते एक पक्का करने के लिए
sections of this were actually potentially completely would have been thrown away. But because the preoccupation was of a certain kind, the same material became interesting. Now, what I want to share with you is actually that with this student, something very unfortunate had happened, which is that when he had almost completed his shoot, he had half a day left. His hard disk, on which he had his entire material, got corrupted, and so he hadn't done a backup. So he lost all his material. So then, what is this? Where has this come from? He ended up making a 25-minute film. It's so interesting for us as filmmakers and as editors to see this, because he had actually been shooting, filming very informally on his camera during his recce and research period. And so when he lost his footage and I said to him that, let's look at your recce material, he said, no, that's rubbish. That's really, really bad. And what happened then through a whole process is that we started re-looking and re-looking. And of course, you see a lot of it is grainy, soft focus, that kind of thing. But it is absolute treasure because, interestingly, because the student was so relaxed and in his own skin, he said, this is just research material, I'm not going to use it in the film. He became more himself. You see what I'm saying? And because he could relax and be more himself, the material carried his perceptions in. So actually he was able to build the entire film. And in fact, there's a lot of research material because basically the perceptions are all contained inside that film. So it's only a question of looking at what the material is desperately trying to tell you, and we're not listening. That happens to us a lot as editors. So having shared this with you, we'll take a short break in 5 minutes for tea. But I just want to share with you a couple of small things. One is that repeats itself, that the process of editing any film is actually a process of also removing that which is unnecessary. And how do you find out what is unnecessary? For that, you have to get to the core of and I have to quote here. I'm quoting Robert Bresson, who talks about editing and says, empty the pond to get the fish. And it's such a simple thing to say, but empty the pond to but what he's saying is basically how to look at your material in such a way that you can glean the maximum from it for your purpose. Empty the pond, reach what is required. And I think that's a very important thing for us, for many of us as editors and filmmakers. So, but tell me, isn't it that all editing and ways of construction that are quite similar in different films? Does that happen? It does, doesn't it? Yeah. And I mean, we can keep searching for the reasons why this happens. But actually, if you're really emptying the pond to get the fish, then you won't replicate the same editing structure. You can't. Because you have a very clear way of approaching that. So it seems to me that I think that when the ideas are predetermined, and predictable or template driven, then the language of editing can be very similar in many different works. I mean, I'm just saying it's important for us to understand this for our own growth and understanding. In fact, sometimes we end up using the very language, the very editing language of those that we disagree with. So you could be making a film which is maybe politically of a certain orientation that I completely disagree with. And there's a certain kind of way of speaking, editing in that film. And I may end up expressing my disagreement and my political point of view in almost exactly the same language, except that the political position has changed. So I think there's a lot of that that gets associated with nonfiction, which is very template driven, actually. So, I mean, I would say that it's not just the form of the editing, but even the intent that is template driven, and probably that's why this happens. So, for instance, the language of propaganda or the language of education can be very similar in many films. So, actually, in a way, then the editing can just be very similar in many films. If the aim is something like that, it's possible. But maybe what I can do is now we take a break and we come back in how much time? Okay, say 10 minutes.
We will be having a 10-minute tea break. After that, session will continue.
And your phone number. Because I really want that if you've got on my list. Stop. I really, a friend of mine is an editor and she wants to, know exactly what was said. And you can WhatsApp me. I can send you.
Yeah, my if you go to YouTube and search for Biju Mo, you will get to my
Biju Mohan?
Biju Mo.
You just upload it?
Yeah, it's live now. It will be uploaded.
Oh,
When I
like you're doing live.
it's getting live.
Oh, nice. I should